Hello and welcome back to Mass Communication 310. This video will be going over the second part of color theory, which primarily looks at how we build contrast and how we can use color within our design. Now, in our first video, we went over the color wheel, which is a 12-part wheel that talks about how colors are placed within one another in the primary, secondary, and tertiary way. Now, I also showed you a video that talked about different types of color complements. Well, we can remember that the primary colors are yellow, blue, and red, and they're set out on a three-part peace sign almost of the primary colors. Secondary are opposite of that sign, green, orange, and purple. And then the tertiary are the six that are in between primary and secondary colors. So when we talk about complementary colors, what we're really talking about is our colors that are across from one another. So green and red, orange and blue, and of course, our favorite, purple and yellow. When we are creating color contrast, we're not necessarily looking for complementary colors. We're looking for colors that are different in brightness between the foreground and background color. We want to build contrast by creating an ease of read. And so we need to really consider, how does this look? How does this text look when I change the background or foreground color? So for vision impaired people, we want to use a contrast checker, which I'll show you here in a second. There are free ones online at Adobe Color. And you also want to check for the vibration effect, which is demonstrated in the bottom right-hand corner, where it's almost glowing off the page. The two colors are contrasting so much because they are similar in tone that it looks like the text is moving. And you've probably seen some of these with like eye puzzles and things like that. It is the contrast of the colors and similar tone that creates that effect. So if you ever see that, you want to go ahead and change your design. But what we're really looking for is nice contrast and high visibility, like we see in the first two boxes. Now, when I talk about those who are vision impaired, we have what are called web content accessibility guidelines in digital design. And these are guidelines that help us to be more accessible in the ways that we publish and design. And so by making sure that people who are visually impaired and those who are using lower quality devices like mobile can still access and see our designs well, what we want to do is use an accessibility tools or a contrast checker similar to the one that Adobe Color has on their website. And I will post the link to Adobe Color in Canvas for us. But what you do is you take the two hex numbers. Remember, the hex number is the hashtag followed by a series of 6 letters or numbers, and it tells you the digital color that you need. Well, what you're looking for is a contrast ratio on the contrast checker. And if there are things that are below the proper contrast level, then you're going to see in the bottom box that it will not pass. And so if you're ever wondering if your image or your colors are visible and readable, not only to the visually impaired, but just everyone who is using a mobile device, this is a great way to do that and make sure that it passes for being able to see regular text, large text, and graphic components. So how do we pick colors for our design? Well, it's basically about contrast.
How do designers go about finding the right color combination for their designs? Picking the right color often has this "I know it when I see it" sort of feeling. But why does this logo look good here, but not so good here. And how does a designer go about picking just the right colors when they're designing something? First off, you can find a lot on the web about color theory. That's all good and fun, but for now, let's throw all that out the window. Don't get me wrong, color theory has its place in the design world, but we tend to place way too much emphasis on it, especially at the beginning of the design process. Picking out a color based solely on the emotion we may or may not associate with that color is really limiting, and it doesn't always hold true. All the logos here have red in them. Red is an aggressive and threatening color. Do these feel aggressive or threatening to you? Okay, this is probably a really bad example. But there are hundreds of red logos out there that don't have those kind of negative associations attached to them. When picking out a good set of colors to work with, the colors themselves have surprisingly little to do with how good they look. Hold up, I can explain. Most of the time, the contrast between colors is more important than the actual colors we pick out. Take this illustrated bottle of water. There isn't much contrast in the colors on this illustration. What does that mean? Let's desaturate this illustration. Let's take all the color out of it. See how the blue and the red are now a very similar shade of gray? That's contrast, or lack thereof. Now if we make this bottle of water a bottle of milk, can you see how much better that contrast is? We can see a clear, sharp line where the white really stands out against that pinkish red background. That's contrast. The yellow button and the logo on the site really stand out because they're surrounded by grays. They're also a slightly lighter color than some of the elements around them. So when we go back to our generic logo, if we want this to stand out more, we should lighten up the color. Or we could go the other way. We could darken the background color, so we make that a darker blue. Yellow, orange, blue, even bright pink. It's going to look fine because we have good contrast between all those colors. Why do we only print the McDonald's logo on a red background? Contrast. Otherwise, it's just too hard to see. Not only can contrast improve the colors that we pick out for our designs, but it's a great way to draw attention to the elements in a design. The higher the contrast, the more something's going to stand out. In this example, the element on the page your eye is most drawn to is the one with the most contrast. The elements with the lower contrast we process as being less important. Using less contrast or very slight contrast is an incredibly powerful design tool as well. Say we don't want to call a lot of attention to something, some elements on a page. Maybe we just want to show that, hey, these are 3 separate chunks. Darkening the background just a little bit in between, it does that. We darken it just enough so it's noticeable, that it says, hey, this is separate than the other elements on the page, but not enough to really call too much attention to it. One of my favorite design techniques is to use a very light gray background or off-white background and then put white boxes over it. This chunks up the content and says, we are a group of things and we belong together. There is a relationship between the elements in this box. But it does it without making it a focal point of the page. If we put a stroke around it or a drop shadow, then it would draw too much attention to itself. I like to take designs that I find on the web and desaturate them in Photoshop just to take a look at how the designs work. Some designers I know actually design in black and white and grayscale and then colorize afterwards. Once my design is set, I might go to a site like Cooler and pick out a design palette I like. From there, I'm probably going to tweak some of the colors anyway just to get the contrast the way I want it within my design. So, how do you do it? How do you choose colors for your designs? Let me know in the comments down below or hit me up on Twitter. And if you enjoy
So let's find out how we would build
How do
our
designers
own color palette. So you notice that he was using an Adobe program called Cooler. Well, they also have a free version called Color. And so a lot of times when you're using a color palette, there are a couple of different places that you might get your color palette from. One, if your company or brand already has a color palette, make sure that you use it because those are brand standard, meaning those are the colors that your brand is meant to use. The Montevallo logo, for instance, is a very specific purple and yellow. So we need to always use the exact same hex code from the logo and from our materials for our materials because you want to use the brand standard colors. However, if you're just creating a color palette for, a unique design project, or maybe you, I don't know, want to redo your room or something, creating a color palette is very easy to do. And the first place you should look is whatever inspires you. We should take pictures or be drawn to colors that we think are vibrant or fun. A lot of times I will take my camera with me and go on a walk or a hike and take pictures there. And drawing inspiration from nature, I can use a color picker tool in order to create a palette that works well together. So let me show you how a brand would use a color palette allowing them to use all of these hex codes anytime they design something. A color palette, though, needs to have some balance. It needs to have contrasting and complementary colors in it. It needs to have some neutrals and some stronger colors. So, for example, PayPal uses 3 shades of blue. These are all complementary hues, but when put together, they make up their logo. And if you check their website and their app, most of the strongest features of their communications are in these 3 colors. Now, of course, they also use black and white. Those wouldn't necessarily go in your color palette, but they can. MasterCard uses these 3 shades of red, orange, and goldy yellow. And then BP uses 2 shades of green and then a light lime green or a lime yellow at the end. So you can see that these are color palettes that these brands are going to use on all of their existing materials. And that's kind of the idea behind creating a color palette. So when I go to create a color palette, here's what I do. I'm in color.adobe.com. This is a completely free program that you can pull up on a website or on your phone. In fact, maybe you want to go ahead and pull it up now so you can practice along with me. But I go into Adobe Color, and all I have to do is tap where it says tap here. You can start on the color wheel section and then drag the 5 boxes around. Those are going to show you different colors. So you can drag just one around and see how it affects the other shades. You can ask it to find monochromatic shades, the triad, complementary, split complementary. So you can see all the different ways of using the color wheel through Adobe Color. And this can be one way that you can build your color palette. And of course, you can change just one of the boxes if you want by selecting them down at the bottom. But I highly encourage you to go ahead and play with Adobe Color and all of the things that it can do. You can also draw from an image, and what's better than a sunset at Disney, right? So when you upload an image into Adobe Color, it's naturally going to give you some complementary colors. So it's just going to draw out some of the strong shades, but you can move your picker around and pick out other shades if you want. You can also use the drop down menu by color mood to pick out colorful, bright, muted, deep, dark, and not have a color mood at all. So these are different ways that you can do that. And then all you have to do is copy the hex code down at the bottom of your color palette. You can either take a screenshot or write them down, and then you have a color palette. So I wanted to show you how this website designer uses color in his design. I don't expect you to be thinking at this level yet, but this is how designers who are very intentional about their use of color would organize their project and then think about their colors. So I hope that you get some inspiration from this.
So I may, for example, carry over the primary brand color as a layout color. Now our layout colors are going
So keep in mind that he is set to only having those colors at his disposals, the 4 colors that he just showed within the brand colors.
to make up most of the structure of our design. It's going to be our background elements, really our foreground elements, title text, subtitle text, body text. What I like to do, I'll carry over a primary brand color and see if it works on both a light and dark background. And if it does, I'll consider that color versatile enough that I can make use of it as a layout color. The next color I like to get hammered down is the low contrast neutral. So on the light side, it's going to be a very light gray, just enough contrast so that you can see it. Very useful for sidebars, form fields, things of that nature that don't need to stand out very much, but do need to be their own containers. On the dark side, it's going to be a dark color that contrasts subtly with its own respective background. And then from there, we can go and we can create our higher contrast background color. And in this case, the higher contrast on the light side is the dark background that you see behind everything on the right. and the high contrast light color that you see on the right is the background that you see on the left. So that is our highest contrast color. We're essentially establishing our whites and our blacks. So white doesn't have to be absolute white. It doesn't have to be F, 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 F. However many Fs make 6 for the hex code white. But then I like to have sort of a reduced version of both of those. On the light side, you see that I have a dark gray that's not quite as dark as that color that's being used as the dark background. And on the dark background side, you can see that I have a lighter shade that isn't quite as light as the color being used as the background on the left. What's cool here is that these two new colors are actually our older, lower contrast colors just crossed over to the other side. The reason for that is we get to save on having extra colors, and at the same time we come up with a color that's low contrast but useful on one background and high contrast but useful on the other background. It's good for things like subtitles, even body text, and things of that nature. This keeps things so super clean and organized without ending up with a bunch of extra shades of gray. Save the 50 shades of gray for your lonely single Aunt Linda. So now that we got our layout colors hammered down, we're ready to talk about what I call denotive colors, because the colors actually mean something. The first denotive color that you might want to set aside for yourself is some sort of shade of red to indicate an error state or a state of something having gone wrong. Now, if one of your brand colors happens to be red, I would highly recommend not using that same red color for your error color, as to not make your brand synonymous with failure. So if red means bad, green generally means good. So the next color that I'll set aside for myself would be some sort of shade of green for success messaging and things of that nature. Now, if your brand colors happen to be green or green-ish, it's not a problem to use the same branded green color for your success color, because it's not a problem for your brand to be synonymous with success. Now you'll notice with these two denotive colors, they span across from the light side to the dark side, because personally, I would rather use just one color that's appropriate for both. The denotive color that's fundamentally different is the disabled state, because this is grayed out in a sense that's essentially low opacity. So low opacity on light is even lighter, low opacity or low contrast on dark is even darker. So we're going to need two distinctly separate shades of gray. On the light side, we've got a lighter shade of gray. On the dark side, we've got a darker shade of gray. And if we slide the dark side over, you can see that they are two distinctly different colors. Now, another important thing to mention about the disabled states is that even though they're a reduced contrast with their own respective background, they've got to have enough contrast that they're readable. This is an accessibility issue. You don't know what kind of screens people are using. You don't know what kind of eyeballs people are using. They could be pretty bad. So just be absolutely sure that the content is readable, even though the visibility is reduced in a sense. Now, last but not least, we have
So I wanted you to be able to see that, because I wanted you to hear from someone who does graphic design exactly how they use color. So how can you use color after you create your color palette? Well, go to Adobe Color and use those hex codes that you grabbed from your color palette, and you copy them over. You can see what colors complement and contrast it, and continue to work with your color palette on your color wheel. Additionally, you can go through and oh, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. Oh, sorry. Just go through and see what kind of complementary colors there are to your different shades. And as I said, you could keep that one shade within your color scheme and then use the others for other complementary colors. So we're going to use the darkest shade first, and then I'm going to go into Canva. I'm going to use a ready-made template for an Instagram post. Just move the templates out of the side, off to the side. Click the background color, which is that rainbow box up in the corner. Replace the hex code with the hex code that you copied over, and now your background is the color from your color chart or your color palette. So then we're going to take a second color from our color palette, go back into Canva. I'm going to click text, type in whatever you want. Hello. And then use the color text form change the hex code there. And then now you have two colors from your color palette. So that's how you can design in Canva using your color palette and making sure that your colors are brand standard. You can even in Canva Pro go up and set your brand colors so that it only displays the colors that you want to use for your brand. Now, of course, you could add others later, but it's nice to have your brand kit available to you because you don't want to go messing with the wrong shade of purple when you're building for Montevallo, as it's a very distinguished brand color. So for now that you've finished both of your lecture videos, I want you to go into your discussion post on color, and you're actually going to be doing a small bit of work in Canva. So make sure you have your Canva Pro on. You're going to create your own color palette from an inspiration photo that you take. And then all you need to do is draw the background box in one of your color palette shades. Do an element from Canva, which will just be a circle. Create the circle in the middle of the square, and then make that circle a second color from your palette. And then for the third element, add text to it and make sure that the text is readable and in contrast. I've given you some directions within the discussion board post, but if you have any questions about how to use Canva or questions about the assignment or anything that we're learning really, please feel free to reach out to me either through email or by Calendly. I hope you guys are having a great rest of your week. Make sure that you read the readings for visuals part 1 and 2 before next week's module.